Hey everyone, as referenced in a previous video, I promised I'd make a video talking about omnipotence, as it most definitely deserved its own video due to it being such a overused term that is also deeply misunderstood by quite a lot of people. And I'm here not only to elaborate on what omnipotence is, but also why there's no such thing as a truly omnipotent character within fiction, and how it's practically impossible to write such a character into a fictional work, even if you yourself attempted it. So if you want to know my reasons for why I believe this, and if you want to see a little surprise about future content, make sure to watch the whole video to the very end. So what is omnipotence? A common misconception surrounding the term omnipotence is that there exists only one true definition of it, which isn't true in regards to almost any word in any language, as any word can vary in meaning or be interpreted differently depending on the context of a given statement. So let's name off the most common definitions of the term omnipotence. The quality of having unlimited or very great power, maximal power or maximal greatness, almighty or infinite power as God, property of being all-powerful, and finally, a deity that is able to do anything that it chooses to do. Now these may not be every single definition in existence, but you'll generally notice that most definitions, and the ones that we talk about in this video, define someone being omnipotent as either having a lot of power, being all-powerful, boundless, and or capable of doing anything, or it's in reference to someone being the supreme being or god of reality. Let's talk about the first definition. Generally, this is the most commonly used definition to vaguely say that X character is really strong. One of the most blatant examples of this is from Marvel Comics, when they clarify that when they use the term, they work under two different definitions. In quote, all-powerful. The term is also used generically to describe numerous beings possessing vast power, which although not unlimited, by far surpasses that of most sentient beings, end quote. So even Marvel's under the assumption that there exists a definition of omnipotence that can be used to be purposely vague about how strong a character is. This is how we can still use statements of omnipotence when in reference to characters such as Odin from Marvel Comics, Arcanist from Magic the Gathering, characters in Dokkan Battle, Yuha from Bleach, Buhan from Dragon Ball Z, and even Kakashi from Naruto, and they can still exist as they can be interpreted as having great power. Because although these characters have clearly demonstrated that they themselves have limits, they could also at the same time be categorized as having great power due to how vague of a claim that is, as having great power is not even remotely impressive as it can practically be applied to literally anything. Assuming the word means the other definition of all-powerful, and such would require us to prove that this character is not limited by any and all means. So it's best to interpret omnipotence as someone having great power, as it doesn't involve creating an inconsistency within our interpretation of a fictional work. And having either infinite or unlimited power can still be applied to a character's power or strength without them being considered an almighty god, as I best explained using set theory in my speed tiering video. But let's elaborate more on the other two somewhat similar definitions of omnipotence, which either refers to a character as the supreme being or a deity that is capable of literally anything. With the first one, you can obviously imply that such a character is just simply the most powerful within their own verse, such as the cases with characters like the Truth in Fullmetal Alchemist, or SCP-001 from SCP Foundation. So yes, it is possible to use the term omnipotent and say said character is the supreme being, but that would only be in reference and or comparison to the characters within the verse that they themselves originate from. To claim that it references to them being the supreme being of every work of fiction is not only a no limits fallacy, but it is a claim that requires astronomical amount of evidence to prove. Even if an author tries to make a similar claim, they're not exempt from this rule as any author can make such an easy claim. And the only way that an author could possibly be exempt from this is if they held the rights to literally every single work of fiction in existence. But even if that were to happen, the author is dead outside the text, which I'll elaborate more in a separate video. And as for the other definition or form of omnipotence, it is most often used when describing deities from monotheistic religions, as this form of omnipotence entails that such a deity isn't just all-powerful, but they are capable of literally anything and everything, which means that they're also omnipresent, omniscient, omnibenevolence, etc. They're also often described as beings who are boundless or absolute. In this context, boundless would mean not being bound by anything and or that you have no boundaries or limits. And absolute would be defined as either a value or principle which is regarded as universally valid or which may be viewed without relation to other things, something that exists without being dependent on anything else, or ultimate reality/God. So to be very clear and blunt, when I make the claim that omnipotence doesn't exist in fiction, I'm referring to this definition and/or interpretation of the term, as I've already explained how it is possible via other definitions for the term to exist without introducing contradictions or an inconsistency. And speaking of which, let's go over some of the most commonly made arguments made in favor of omnipotent characters existing, arguments against that very notion, as well as other common misconceptions surrounding omnipotence. Number 1. The plan. This argument has been made so often that it's practically become almost as much of a meme as Saitama being able to one-shot any character in fiction, as it has been most commonly argued for characters in fiction like the presence in DC, or the one above all in Marvel. People will argue that any time that they supposedly lose or even die for that matter, it was all a part of their plan or that they wanted to lose. This is a flawed argument for many reasons. Firstly, if we assume that if a character loses because they wanted to, therefore it's not a limitation, then literally anyone and every character can be omnipotent via the same reasoning. Secondly, just having a plan for something doesn't mean you can't lose. For example, Batman has made a contingency plan for the Justice League, but when he actually faces off against them, he loses. Thirdly, even if a character has desires, as in they want to lose, this in itself is a limitation and thereby making them not omnipotent, as that'd be proof that a character is bound by desires. Number 2. The omnipotent paradox. A popular thing that will get talked about in regards to debunking or arguing in favor of omnipotence existing is what's called the omnipotent paradox, which is as follows. Can an omnipotent being create a rock they themselves cannot lift? Firstly, an omnipotent being would be transdual by definition. Being transdual or transduality is defined as the state of being wherein an entity exists independently of and qualitatively beyond various dual systems, ranging from very specific limited sets of dual distinctions to duality itself on a conceptual level. So they would be transdual to being transdual and ad infinitum to the ideas of lifting the rock and not lifting the rock, and whether they can create the rock or not as well, as being transdual would entail that you would not be limited or bound by contradictions. Essentially, the omnipotent paradox is not this ultimate debunk to the existence of omnipotence as most people, even I was guilty of believing this, had been led to believe. But not like this matters anyway, as there still exist other arguments I have either already presented that does debunk omnipotence, and there are still I have yet to bring up, as well as the fact that most characters that would be considered outer-versal would also exceed the same duality that supposed omnipotent characters would, which I'll talk about more in my videos regarding the tiering system. Number 3. Omnipotent characters being fictional characters. This is a topic I've somewhat already touched upon in a previous video, when I talked about the Reality-Fiction Interaction Fallacy, which if you're unaware of this fallacious line of reasoning, I recommend you go give that video a watch. But essentially, if an omnipotent character is not supposed to be bound or limited by anything, then simply being a fictional character would demonstrate them as limited to being fiction. So then we have to go into feats to actually scale a character and what they have shown to be capable of doing. So they cannot be all-powerful while also being limited to being fiction aside from feats. This is a problem that virtually every character power scaling hypebeast attempt to use, otherwise being someone who scales a verse because it's strong. Each one of them, by being a character in a story, is inherently limited by something, be it the verse they are within, or the things that they aren't shown doing. For example, let's look at Truth from Fullmetal Alchemist. Sure, he has statements of being the world and such, but when we see him in verse, he has no feats for being any higher than at best Universal Plus. So why would we randomly assume these baseless claims that he's all-powerful are true when the feats don't add up? Going by that same logic, is the Flash also the fastest in fiction because he says he's the fastest man alive in every comic? Number 4. Author-inserted characters. Another thing that people who try to scale these characters to omnipotence will try to do is say, they're the real-world author, and therefore unbeatable, as all the other characters are fiction that you'd put them up against. This goes back to what I said earlier about characters in fiction being inherently limited. Well, let's say they are the author. Well, we wouldn't randomly assume they exist in our real world, as I again elaborated on in a previous video. So the character is now a fictional author writing the verse below them into existence. A fictional transcendence is far lesser than the difference between a dimensioned being and an undimensioned or outer-versal being. A fictional transcendence is as best compared to being a higher dimensioned being, as you are looking at a world as flat just as we would see paper, assuming that the paper was actually 2D. With all this in mind, it makes absolutely no sense to assume someone being a fictional representation of the author magically makes them stronger than the characters who have impressive cosmologies behind their feats. Number 4. Why the conclusion that something is omnipotent is lazy. So besides the issues that I've already covered, There's a larger issue with saying a character's omnipotent. This issue being the fact that it is a lazy conclusion that leaves no room for interpretation. By that I mean, saying a character's omnipotent is inevitably coming to a conclusion with no room for nuance. So let's suppose for instance the presence is actually omnipotent. Well, now we can't talk about people being stronger than him or how far below, say, Lucifer is than him. Just by making one interpretation, we have inevitably killed off two areas where there was room for interpretation, because in order for the presence to be omnipotent, we don't have to say anytime someone scales to the presence it's just him holding back, as it's part of his plan and thereby unquantifiable. Compare this with tiering the presence accurately into DC's cosmology, and we have a much longer discussion ahead of us covering the topics like how strong is Mixie actually, and whether some statements would make the characters above the presence or not. With this line of interpretation, we have opened up the floor for much more discussion and nuance, and that was all solely from an introverse or inside of one verse standpoint. Now let's look at it from an interverse or between verses standpoint. With the presence being this very limited being within DC, we can now actually have a meaningful debate between him and the one above all. Comparing that to if they were both omnipotent, it'd just be like, well, they're both all powerful, so they stalemate, I guess. This is the exact problem that arose with the interpretations people have with gag characters as well, which I talked about in a previous video. Another lazy conclusion that people will typically go to in verses they perceive to have an omnipotent character is the idea of a nigh-omnipotent being. Typically, this would be someone who can only lose to an omnipotent being, which I'm sure we can all see why this would be a lazy conclusion. Well, to use the presence again as our example, and let's say Lucifer Morningstar is the nigh-omnipotent for DC, now discussions like Neuron versus Lucifer and a lot of the stuff in Hell regarding who sits on the throne are all ruined because Lucifer is just this de facto stronger than all of them via being nigh omnipotent. Obviously, if we take that away and just say Lucifer is just really strong, now we can discuss whether or not he's stronger than Neuron and how the other rulers of Hell scale in regards to him with more nuance even if he ends up being stronger. And as a supplementary point, the term nigh omnipotent is such a blatant oxymoron, which is a figure of speech which apparently contradictory terms appear in conjunction. With the term nigh omnipotent, we have two components of the word, that being the prefix and the root. The prefix in this case being nigh, which means almost or close to, then we have the root being omnipotent, which if you listen to the video, you would know what that word means. So this word nigh omnipotent means close to or almost omnipotent. Now there are obvious problems like how close to omnipotence are they? So let's say we're doing a versus matchup between two supposed nigh omnipotent characters like Lucifer Morningstar and the Beyonders. Do they stalemate? Can we measure how far away from omnipotence they are? Can they have separate powers while being in this tier of nigh omnipotence? The questions pile on. Meanwhile, if we just tier by feats, we can conclude that Lucifer Morningstar is higher reversal and has such and such abilities. Compare that to the Beyonders' abilities in tiering, and we have a legitimate conversation that doesn't evolve into shrugging our shoulders. But anyway, that's it for the video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you want to see more content like this, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and set your notification bell to all so you'll be immediately notified whenever a new video comes out. Comment down below on any video topics you want me to see me cover in the future. But until then, thank you all for watching, and class is dismissed.
Coming soon to theaters.